Welcome to Myth Informed. I'm your host, Brian Edward. Sean Frasick will be sitting aside me momentarily. He's now at the engineering station. I am really excited for this podcast. We are with Dr. Karlyn Borysenko. She is an organizational psychologist and trainer, author, and executive coach. She became an accidental political and cultural commentator after her article about being a Democrat who attended a Trump rally went viral, garnering over 3 million views in a week. After that, according to her, she kept running her mouth on the internet from a perspective of a centrist, profoundly disturbed by the tribal polarization on both sides of the aisle and by the impact of social justice ideology on culture. You can find her on Twitter at Dr. Karlyn B, on Parler, Minds, Gab at Karlyn, and on YouTube. Welcome, Dr. Borysenko.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really excited to see you. I personally saw you while I was looking at things related to white fragility on the internet and came across the video of your first half. You're like, guys, I got through the first half of white fragility and I couldn't take anymore, and then you really broke it down. That was awesome. I want to put that back on the back burner a little bit, even though I put the stake right in front of you. But I'm going to pull that back a second and ask, what does an organizational psychiatrist or psychologist do?
Well, I want to say, too, I think you're being a little nice in your characterization of that video in which I slowly descended into madness and cried on the internet. But backing up a second to try to maintain some professional integrity. So an organizational psychologist is essentially, I'm not an HR person. I'm not that. I'm a psychologist that works with businesses to help create work environments that keep morale up, keep productivity up, keep people focused on what they're doing so that businesses can achieve the very best results they can, because at the end of the day, businesses are comprised of people, and if people are miserable, they're not going to do their best work. So that's where I come in. I do trainings around how to be a great manager, how to communicate with different work styles, how to collaborate well. I do a lot of work around bringing mindfulness practices into the workplace to help people reduce their stress, things like that.
Okay, so you want to you're not working for a single company, but you work with a lot of companies to help improve productivity and just like the flavor of the workspace.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I have my own practice, and I work with a lot of companies. I tend to work with more medium-sized, small to medium-sized companies, because those are the companies that you can actually affect change in.
Mm-hmm.
I do work with trainings, because it's just impossible to actually make larger change in bigger, more red tape laden companies.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, that's good. So you could be just doing that full time, right? But you became an accidental cultural and political commentator, and you went to a Trump rally, and I think this was February of this year in New Hampshire.
Yeah, sounds about right. It was the day before the New Hampshire primary, so about like February 10th, I think. So
tell us about that. You weren't you weren't a Republican though, right? So but bring us, for those that don't know you, tell the story.
No, so I was not a Republican. I am still not a Republican. So to understand how I got to the Trump rally, we actually have to rewind about a year ago. And this is a little bit of a crazy story, but I'm a knitter. And this might seem unrelated to the Trump rally, but it's not. About a year and a half ago, what started happening in the online knitting community was social justice started taking over my hobby. And these roving gangs of social justice warriors went around bullying and mobbing people for stupid things, like posting a blog post about being excited about going to a trip to India, or posting a poem asking for kindness. These were bullying offenses. And it got so badly that one of the people that the mob went after actually ended up checking himself into the hospital on suicide watch. Mm. And I kind of sat back and was watching this destruction take place. And at some point, I realized that these are people that I had politically aligned myself with. I'd been a Democrat since I was 18 years old. I've always considered myself to be a liberal. And I was just really uncomfortable with that. Now, at the same time, living in New Hampshire, I'm very spoiled. in that I got to see every major Democratic candidate for president because they start campaigning in New Hampshire like a year before they start campaigning everywhere else. So I had seen all of them in person. And at that time, I was very much vote blue no matter who. We have to get Donald Trump out. But I started realizing in the span of all this that I didn't really understand what people saw in Donald Trump, to be honest. And those two things kind of came together and sent me down the YouTube rabbit hole. And I challenged myself to start listening to voices that I thought I would disagree with. Things like I watched walkaway videos. I watched Ben Shapiro. I watched a lot of podcast. I watched, Rubin Report, things like that, thinking I was going to have these profound disagreements with people, and then finding out that, of course, once I actually stopped to listen to them, that I didn't actually disagree with them on a lot of things. And I do disagree with them on some, but not a lot. Mm-hmm. And so this happened over the course of many months, and it kind of led up to the day before the New Hampshire primary, and Donald Trump was coming to town, and I kind of thought, like, why not go to a Trump rally? This is like my big graduation exercise of this whole endeavor. And so as a Democrat, I went and I stood in the big long line outside the arena. But I got there like 4 hours early or something. And you just start interacting with people and talking to people. And I discovered, to my shock, because MSNBC had told me these were all horrible, deplorable people, to my utter shock, they actually really weren't. And so I met, small business owners, teachers, veterans, just had great conversations. Sometimes I let it slip that I was a Democrat, and the response was always, welcome, we're so glad you're here. And so I just had a great time at the Trump rally. It was a lot of fun. It was much more fun than the Democratic event that I had gone to literally 2 days earlier in the same place. And it just started to change my perception about everything. And I felt like I started to understand what was going on in the dynamics of the country in a new way that I just hadn't understood. Excuse me, hang on. In my liberal cushy echo chamber. Oh my goodness!
It choked you. It choked you up still.
When I'm live.
Yeah, it choked you up still, right?
Mm-hmm. No, it does. And so I kind of came home, and the next day I was sitting in my office thinking about the experience. Sorry, guys.
No worries.
And I had to write an article about it. I just felt like I had to share the experience I had, and mostly thought, that my lefty friends would just want to read it and try to understand it. And that was really the only audience that I had for it. So it got a couple hundred views the first day, and then the next day it kind of blew up, and it was everywhere. And so that's my Trump rally story.
So did
you
sort of feel like maybe take, for an example, that somebody was like a very conservative Christian and they went to a punk concert one time, and then they came back and they wanted to tell some of the Christians, but they didn't eat bats. They weren't worshiping that. These people were normal, fun people, just maybe misunderstood. Is that a reasonable analogy?
That's a very fair analogy. And, in my article, I didn't say anything about, that I was going to vote for Donald Trump. And I had kind of already decided to leave the Democratic Party at that point. It was just very clear to me, especially after the Trump rally, that the Democrats had just gone off a cliff to the point that I was not comfortable being a part of it any longer. And so a couple days later, I did leave the party. Now I'm an independent. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I think that both sides have their own levels of insanity.
Yeah, agreed.
Not the same type of insanity, but definitely their own distinct brands. And really, I think, I think that what I'm more interested in now than most things is there a way to bridge the political divide that's happened in this country? Because it's infected everything, and we can't even have conversations anymore that are rational and nuanced, and everything is just black and white, right or wrong. You're a good person or a bad person, and it's incredibly divisive, and I don't think it's good for us in the long run.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you think identity is at the core of this? Do you believe that it's more policies that have drifted apart, or we're talking to me, everything seems identity based?
Well, It is and it isn't, because it's not really about identity at the end of the day. That's what they want you to think that it's about, but it's not about that. It's about power. It is about a group of people wanting to be the ones that are making the decisions. And we see this every single time someone that fits into one of their marginalized identity groups starts to speak up and contradicts the things that we're saying. I mean, we see this. The Walkaway campaign is actually a really great example of this. You know, Walkaway went to do an LGBT town hall in San Francisco several months ago, and what happened? But the venue canceled on them, and there were massive protests. So that those are the quote unquote marginalized people, and they should have fit right in if it were just about identity. But because they're saying things that contradict what they want, they are cast out and shunned from the group, because it's not about identity, it's about power.
Or is the meaning of identity changed? I mean, the quote was attributed, I think it was Out magazine, made about Republican Peter Thiel, the venture capitalist, that said he has relationships and sex with men, but in no other way is he gay. Right? So that this happens, right? So it's not that you're gay, but it's rather what you believe and you're gay. I think this is also true with skin color, that there's something that's being authentically black that has nothing to do with race, because if you are a black person that goes steps outside of that acceptable identity views, you are no longer black. Kanye West, no longer black. Ben Carson, not black, but they're black.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you think that it's changed and it's more of a set of to-dos and taboos than it is a race or a sexuality?
Well, again, I mean, this is all about power. Who gets to decide that Ben Carson and Kanye West aren't black? Who gets to make that decision? It's the person, it's whoever is in charge of their little power structure game. Because again, this is not about identity. No one gets to define your identity for you. No one gets to define my identity. No one gets to define your identity except for you. And, all truths are true to those who believe them. If I believe I'm a certain thing, then who is anyone else to tell me I'm not, right? But I mean, in this little game that they're playing, they are setting themselves up to be the ultimate decider. And in that way, it is not about identity. It is simply about who gets to make the decisions. And I think, another great example of this is, and this is not directly related to identity, but I just think it's a really good example of how much all of this is about power, is the Chaz in Seattle. When it first started up, what did they do? They kicked out the police. They immediately built a wall, which is against all their stated principles of this little game that they're playing. And they created their own police force.
Yeah.
So why are they doing that if they are really taking a principled stance based on protecting the marginalized and making sure Black Lives Matter? Because it's not about any of those things.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, it could be, take a religion, for example, right? If you say that the host and the wine are not, in fact, the body and blood of Jesus, this is heretical to Catholic belief, right? So if I say that, I've put myself outside of what Catholic is, regardless of what I want to say. So I could be kicked out for that, right? But I want to say, no, but I'm Catholic. See, I feel like that's the same thing.
But I think that's what she's saying, though.
Authentically Catholic or authentically black, authentically gay.
I think that's what she's saying, though. It's the mob. The mob has come together and decided on certain principles and ideologies that you should hold, and if you buck those, you're no longer part of that. So it's not necessarily about identity. Again, it's what Karlyn's saying. It's about power.
But it is with the Catholic Church. You could negotiate with the Pope, right? The Pope could change it, right? There's no one that speaks for the mob. So I think it makes it more dangerous.
I think there are a couple of people that speak for the mob, and I think we'll get into one of their prophets, later on today, which I'm really excited to talk about. But I do think there are certain individuals that do speak for the mob. AOC would be one. Bernie Sanders. I think there are people that side listen to, and do they always agree? No, not necessarily, but for the most part they do, and that's where they get a lot of their chanting songs and their mottos and the statements they come up with.
But it's decentralized, like Islam. I mean, it's not Christianity or
it is decentralized.
Catholicism where you do have a
Pope. Right. Well, but I mean, we've been arguing with Holiday on Twitter all day when he's saying Antifa is not an organization, yet if you're anti-Antifa, you are fascist. So it's like, in one case they're saying Antifa isn't a group, but in the other case they're saying we do support them in their protests. So it's like, which one is it? Are they a group or aren't they a group? So
Right. So, but when we talk about, say, black issues, you mentioned in your article that you do believe there's very real issues when it comes to race, and we I think as a society have yet to reckon with. What are those?
Well, I mean, I think that there are discussions to be had, and mostly related, honestly, to socioeconomic status rather than race specifically. But it just so happens that, we'll just take the Black community, for example, just for the sake of simplicity. It just so happens that I mean, they are disproportionately disadvantaged when it comes to socioeconomic status. But let's not pretend for 1 second that Will Smith's kids have the same challenges as someone that's grown up in like the inner city in Chicago, right? Those are two completely different circumstances. So I think there absolutely are conversations to be had in regards to how do we make sure that everyone actually does have equal access to opportunity, that people of color have schools that they can go to that are going to provide them with a quality education, that they have role models in their lives. I mean, if we look at one of the things that afflicts the Black community more than, almost any other thing, it's fatherless households in which there's no male role model. And that deeply impacts the kids that are raised in those households. So how can we have conversations? And I'm in favor of even having conversations about reparations in some form. Now, I'm not in favor of giving money to descendants of slaves. I think that's just way too complicated, and I don't think that's actually going to fix anything. But are there investments that we could make in programs that are legitimately going to help more disadvantaged communities that could have a real impact? Because sometimes when you throw money at things, that really does solve a lot of problems. Now, do I know exactly what those investments are? Absolutely not. I am not the person to ask about that. I work in businesses, man. But I mean, I think there could be conversations to have. The problem is that we cannot have those conversations in this environment. And, it's so sad to me that we had a moment after George Floyd's murder where everyone agreed. Everyone agreed. Everyone was on board that this was horrible. This should not happen, that there should be some reforms in regards to how the police are trained. We could have had a good conversation at that point. And then what happened? It blew up, and there were riots and looting, and we lost the ability to have any nuanced conversation about the issue. Yep.
I agree 100%. Right. Yeah, being a corporate trainer myself, so I've worked with third-party trainers such as yourself, and that's the first thing that came to mind was training. Now we're talking about defunding the police. That's actually going to take more resources away from those programs to train police officers on how to react in certain scenarios. And yeah, I think it's completely backwards, So go ahead, Brian, you're going to make your point, but I agree with that 100%.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a second. But one of the things that even if we had this perfect, I hear that if we had perfect equality of opportunity, that still doesn't help equity, right? There's going to be a lag, and but I think it's central to identity, because what if your last name is Johnson, and the Smiths have an average income quite a bit higher than all Johnsons, but since you don't take your last name that seriously, you're not really caring if you care. Well, I care about myself. Right, and I care about my family and so on and so forth. I don't really care about how I relate to all Johnsons. But if you're Black in America, you may say, but we've had a harder time with things like slavery, Jim Crow, other segregation laws. And then especially you could say even 30 years ago, being harassed by the police more, that we have a bigger grievance on this anti-policing thing than white people do. What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, I think that first off, there is not a living person today that was actually a slave, right? I mean, we've moved beyond that by many, many decades at this point. And I think that too, I mean, this is why I think that there should actually be a conversation about reparations, because I think there could be investments made in, again, lower socioeconomic status communities. We should not be making these investments for Will Smith's children or Colin Powell's children. That's not the problem. But ultimately, I don't think that equity should actually be the goal, because when we're talking about equity, what universally happens is not that everyone gets lifted up to the highest level. It's that everyone gets brought to a mediocre level, which fundamentally means that, yes, some people are going to come from the lower levels and come up to that mediocre level, but some people are also going to come from higher levels and be brought down to it. I mean, this is the very basis of Harrison Bergeron, which I just actually watched the movie too from the 90s the other day. It was fabulous. But I mean, that is not an ideal society. That is just dumbing everything down. And I think that we should be getting to a place where we give people opportunities, but you can never force people to take those opportunities. You can never force people to work hard. I mean, coming from corporate training, you understand this. You can give people all the tools and all the resources and all the support that they could ever ask for, and you still cannot make them show up. That's got to be their choice.
Okay. That's right. Well, I do want to make this point too on the reparations, Brian. Like when it comes to business and starting your own business, the U.S. government already offers certain loans and grants to businesses that do start up in lower socioeconomic areas. So there's forgivable loans. There's a bunch of money that we already put into those systems. And what the idea is, if we can give businesses more money to start up in lower socioeconomic areas, those areas will start to blossom because now you have more business, more jobs, more, the economy gets better. Unfortunately, the reality of it is when they do start up in those areas, a lot of them do end up closing because of crime. There's so much crime to, like the burger stand or the coffee shop or whatever, that they just can't stay in business because they're getting robbed, people are getting killed. So, there has to be a point where the local neighborhood has to claim responsibility and say, look, we have to stop doing this. And so we can't sit here and pretend like the government already doesn't offer projects and opportunities for people to pull themselves out of these situations. So I just want to bring that up.
But my final point was, like, is there anything to the idea that you should recognize the wound if you're talking about this, like Native American issues specifically and Black American issues? Is there something in that?
I think that you can recognize the wound, but the problem is not that we're not recognizing the wound. The problem is that we're letting the wound get in the way of actually moving forward. Now, this is a question I actually get all the time when I do training or organizations from women. They say, Karlyn, how can I get ahead as a woman? It's a man's world, and I don't have as many opportunities as my male coworkers. And what I tell them universally is you have got to stop worrying about being the only woman in the room.
Exactly.
You've just got to stop giving that any credit, because the minute that you start worrying, it's all a head game, right? If you're going to go into a room and you're going to be presenting to all these, stuffy white male cisgendered straight executives, like if you start psyching yourself out and thinking they're never going to agree with what I'm saying because I'm a woman, well, you've shot yourself in the foot before you've even started. So just stop worrying about it and go in and be strong and say what you want to say.
That's right. That's right. And I think that's the problem with collectivism. Me being a Hispanic American, I'm being collectivized and lumped with all these Hispanics saying, oh, well, you're a victim. You can't do this and that. And it actually offends me when people look at me and treat me differently based on my nationality. I mean, there's a lot of those people, too, and their voices aren't being heard because as soon as you say that, well, you get kicked out of the club. And so, it's ridiculous.
That's a good point, Karlyn. I think you could then have different minority groups, aggrieved minority groups that now are comparing wounds. I mean, how do you decide whether the Native American wound is bigger than the Black American
or the Jewish wound?
Yeah.
I mean,
or even smaller wounds like the Irish American. Like
even
Irish
the
weren't white.
Chinese American.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes, especially in the West Coast, right? I mean, Portland has a long history of anti-Chinese. But they didn't have as much Black population in Oregon, but. That's really interesting. So one of the ways then I want to transition to that topic, the topic that I saw you first on YouTube was, so white fragility now is, and this sort of training has offered itself as a solution to this. So there's your view and like that statement that you just made in the workplace.
Yeah.
And the white fragility training.
Well, I just want to, can I set this one up, Bray?
Yeah.
Okay. So as a corporate trainer, Karlyn and I know, before you even put together a training, you have to identify an issue, but then also have a way to define what success looks like. That's the question you always have to ask yourself in a corporation. Actually, you should ask it in your everyday life. What does success look like? If we do X, we should see Y. We should see this is the measurable result from the training. Now, with based on what I'm seeing, and Karlyn, you can correct me if I'm wrong, based on what I'm seeing with white fragility, there are no measurables. She doesn't say XYZ company did this training. Now they're seeing this as a result. This is a positive feedback. She's not giving case studies to sell this training, yet corporations are still picking it up and paying thousands of dollars for it. Can you take me through that? Like what's going on?
Yeah, you're 100% right. Robin DiAngelo does not provide any evidence that regarding the effectiveness of her training. And in fact, I've been pleading with people on Twitter, like, if you agree with this training, come and show me the evidence that it works. And not one person has taken me up on this offer. But I mean, I think it's actually also interesting, even just flipping through the book. First off, the book is written. These are her personal stories. And now I don't necessarily think that there's anything wrong with people who do corporate training or coaching or any of these things to share their personal stories. I actually think that can be a really effective way of teaching. Mm-hmm. But when you're making broad generalizations about very large groups of people, saying all white people think this way and all black people think this way and the white mind does this and the white mind does that, you have to provide some evidence to back that up. And I think one of the most interesting things is actually not even the content of the book, it is the sourcing. So if you look in the work cited, a lot of people have asked me this question, like, does she actually cite sources? She does. There's about 6 pages worth of sources for the whole book that are in the back. The book I wouldn't say it's very well cited. Like, it has significantly more sources than the second half of the book. And so this is important because in the first half of the book, what Robin DiAngelo does is basically, I think what she did was maybe take her dissertation or some paper that she wrote to set up this concept of white fragility. The second half of the book is all about her actual training in organizations, and she cites very, very minimal sources. In fact, the 2 chapters in which she talks the most about the actual training that she does have 0 sources to back up what she's saying. It's all about her personal experience. Yeah. And so can we reasonably take what is in this book and apply it to broad groups of people? No, we can't. There's no evidence to back it up.
Yeah. I think you said, like, if she changed the name of the book to, like, rich, bougie, sheltered white woman fragility, you'd be okay with it.
Yeah.
I'd be completely okay with it because that is exactly what that book is about.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is when you're doing a training, you want to know your audience. You always want to bring your audience together. You don't want to divide them, and that's kind of what she does in this. She's dividing people based on race. She'll hold different trainings for different peoples of race, and like in a workplace, that's so divisive. Like, you'd never want to see that, but also what she's saying is, look, based on you're white, so you think this way. In a corporate training, like typically in corporations, we pride ourselves on not treating people differently based on any of their, any like their race, their gender, any of that. How is she getting away with this? Like in corporate America, how is she getting away with this?
I truly don't know. And I think she's actually not even just dividing by race. She's actually also dividing by gender. Yep. There's a whole chapter in the book called White Women's Tears, in which she just talks about how she lectures white women not to cry in her trainings. How she's getting away with it, I think that, White Fragility's been out for a couple years, and it's been a book that has kind of been around. But in the past since George Floyd's death, it's really exploded in the book in America. And I think the reason it's exploded is not as a result of any merit of the book at all, but it's a reflection of organizations needing to do something. Yeah. That's all it is.
She herself admits that.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, she herself admits that.
So you're saying it's the CEO or the head of HR or the head of whatever, head of sales, they're checking a box.
I think that the HR people mostly actually buy into this nonsense. Okay. I mean, I've gotten incredible blowback from the HR community. That's usually where the diversity inclusion offices are and things like that. I'll tell you what, though. Every single CEO or executive that I've talked to about this, privately one-on-one, this is not their public statements, obviously, they don't buy into this stuff at all. What they're saying is, if we don't do this, then we're going to get the mob coming after us, and we don't want that. So they are very literally checking a box. They don't care if it's effective. And of course, they aren't even measuring if it's going to effective. And to your point, they have no idea what success even looks like in this scenario.
Okay. So let me try it out, since Robin DiAngelo isn't here on our podcast, and we invite her to the Better Discourse
conference. We invited her. We didn't hear back.
Yeah, normally we don't invite avowed racists to our conference, but we're going to make an exception for DiAngelo. So if you're listening, Dr. DiAngelo, you're definitely welcome on 8/16 to come to our conference, and we will put you on the Racial Equity panel. Opposite. Dr. Karlyn.
I would love that, DiAngelo.
But let me. So in her absence, let me try to steel man the point as best I can. Okay, take you guys are talking about will this improve? But now take something like affirmative action. When it initially came out in the 60s, affirmative action was not about quotas, but rather for, say, like a high-powered law firm to take a look and go take affirmative action to make sure that black resumes hit their desk. There was no, but to say
but
that
quotas
right,
came after.
Right,
though,
but the point was, there's no benefit to the company necessarily from a financial perspective because the best black lawyers and the best white lawyers are going to do about the same. The point was specifically a moral one, right? And generally we would think that's okay. That would be a good thing to do. So therefore, this is a good thing to do. How do you respond to that?
Is there a question there?
Yeah. So that's my steel man of the point. So I'm going to present white fragility training as
a positive, but it
no
can't be it can't be measured yet because it's too new. So therefore, we can't criticize it and say it's not effective.
Yeah,
that's what you're saying.
Yeah, Sagar.
Okay.
No. Pause. Hang on. This type of training has existed for over a decade.
That's true.
At least. In fact, the city of Seattle right now, the city of Seattle is actually doing racially segregated training. They have training for their white employees and they have training for their black employees. They're using a document that is at least it's over 10 years old at this point. I know because I'm actively analyzing it on my channel.
Yes.
To talk about what a white supremacist culture in organizations looks like. So I guess my question is, and it existed before that, but that's just the furthest back example I have off the top of my head. If this industry is 10 years old and you don't have measurable outcomes yet to show that it actually works and it actually means something and results in something, how much longer is it going to take?
Correct. And I love what you're doing when you're taking that document and you're comparing it to DISC. So this is going to get very nerdy, so I don't know how many people are going to enjoy the work talk, but so we're talking about DISC and also, Myers-Briggs. I mean, these personality tests. Now, when those first hit corporate and we were forced to administer them and take them, I wasn't a huge fan of them, but at the same time, it was to highlight myself, to showcase, okay, this is how I act in a group. This is my personality. This is how I would interact. This is how I can change my personality to interact with other people, in a more productive way. So it wasn't like a huge deal. But when you start talking about D&I or in even worse, white fragility, you're not, it's not the individual anymore. Now you're grouping people and you're making assumptions on them based on something they can't control. And that corporate was always starkly against it. No matter what corporation you're at, they were always, you would never, interview someone. You can't ask about their religion, their sexual orientation, any of that stuff. That's all legal in interviews. But now we're making this weird exception for these trainings to do exactly what corporate was supposed to be against for decades. So I don't know. I just see it as nothing but a negative. DISC I'm fine with, and I love that you're bringing it to DISC and explaining like, hey, this is why this you can just take DISC and you get the same information. But
so is the question then what's the difference between a white fragility training and a DISC training?
Okay, so I mean, I think you kind of actually just outlined it, which it is literally the difference between the individual view versus the collective view. Mm-hmm. And Robin DiAngelo writes about this in her book. It's also in the white supremacy culture document that I'm analyzing, where they're asserting that if you take an individual approach to work, to life, to whatever, that's a white supremacist approach. And so what is the opposite of individual? It's about collectivist. It's about the group. So when I'm doing with the white supremacist document, that I'm analyzing is I'm basically showing how you can explain all of the different grievances they have by looking at differences in that. There was a time when DISC really kind of sucked, honestly, in the workplace. But they've done a lot to make these assessments freakishly accurate, and they have administered millions of them all over the world. And so we can assess to a pretty accurate degree about how someone's going to show up in the workplace. And when I'm looking at all these grievances about what is a white supremacist culture, they are entirely explainable just by looking at the differences in work style. Does someone take a more skeptical approach or a more open approach? Are they more fast-paced or more moderately paced? Or, and we could go down the list for days about all of this. But it is, getting back to it, it is just the difference between an individual view and a collective view.
And is it an anti-scientific approach? It sounds like what DISC is doing is using scientific method to make their tests more accurate and more rigorous and again, keep improving on them. Would you say that white fragility is you doing the same thing?
Kind of. I mean, I think one of the things that really frustrates me about white fragility in general is, when you're saying a scientific approach, oftentimes that's associated with a more quantitative approach to research, using the scientific method to do research and all that. But there is actually a lot of value to qualitative research. In fact, I'm a qualitative researcher. My doctoral dissertation was a qualitative one. And what the grievance studies, like Robin DiAngelo, these gender studies things have done is they've taken the idea of qualitative research and they've bastardized it to where it doesn't mean anything. It is not there are rigorous ways to approach qualitative research. And when I say qualitative, I just mean like stories. So like when Robin DiAngelo is telling stories about her experiences, that would be an element of qualitative research. However, what they do is they take one person's lived experience and they say, this is all the evidence I need. Whereas if you're actually doing qualitative research in a rigorous way, you're interviewing many, many, many different people and looking for themes across all those interviews. And that's when you declare it's a lived experience.
Can you give us a good example of like good qualitative research studies or an example of that?
Oh, I mean, I don't know if it's a great. I'll use my dissertation as an example. I like to think my dissertation was pretty good. So when I did my dissertation, I studied the lived experiences of young professionals who were coping with being the target of workplace bullying. And so what I had to do was I went out and found, first you have to establish inclusion and exclusion criteria to say, these are specifically the type of people I study, so we know what populations we're talking about. And then you have to go out and recruit people that meet those specific standards and do this. You have to issue the same interview questionnaire with them. So it's all very standardized. Then you take those interviews, you have them transcribed, and you do analysis on every single word that they chose to come up with themes. And you do this over and over and over and over and over again until you stop seeing new themes show up. It is actually a very intense way to do research. It's much more difficult than quantitative research, honestly, where they're just handing out a survey and then, running a statistical program. But when we're looking at things like the basis of white fragility, they're not doing that type of research. Again, they're just taking Robin DiAngelo's experience and Robin DiAngelo's perspective, and that's the basis for everything.
Yeah. So I got a really, really important question for you, Karlyn. So, yeah, so we have a lot of people that are going to be face-to-face with this thing very shortly. And, in some cases, there are some already DNI trainings and stuff. But in the case of white fragility, it's brilliant in the way that you can't even challenge it without them also proving that you have white fragility. So if you go in and you say, look, I don't agree with this. I don't think we should be judging people based on the color of their skin. I treat everyone the same. They have already... they have and they're creating acolytes. So you can get a training certificate in this now, and there's going to be all these like disciples running around teaching this. So when they come to your work and they say, "Okay, we're going to do this," the question is: A, do you challenge it? And B, if you do challenge it, let's say you are in HR and you are in a power position where you can challenge this, what is the best way to challenge it, in your opinion?
Yes. So James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose on New Discourses have actually released really specific guidance for how to challenge it and how to write letters to your HR department. And James Lindsay actually had an amazing series of tweets where he said, if you have to sit through one of these white fragility trainings, here is how you ask specific questions to poke holes in these trainings. And I think that their advice is pretty great. So I would refer people there. But honestly, for the average person, and this is not going to be the answer that people want to hear, but just to give it broader context. So we know that executives are just doing this to check a box. They don't actually care about it, right? The easiest thing to do for the average person is to suck it up, Go do the training, pretend you care about the training, but keep your head about you, because this can suck you into madness as it did me, and just check off the box and go back and do your job. That's going to be the path of least resistance.
Yeah, well, that's why it's so sinister, because they have these kernels of truth. So when you are sitting there, it's like, oh man, that makes sense. So like I love when you were talking about Scientology, and we work with Ron Miscavige. He's the father of David Miscavige.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So Ron's been a friend. I've managed him. I've set him up for different things, and he's come out. He's been out since 2016 now. He was in for over 30 years, and now he's telling the real stories of like what's happening behind the scenes. And a lot of it boils down to, they give you these kernels. They give you these little bits of truth that you're like, yes, I agree with that, and then it takes you deeper and deeper and deeper. He has this really good analogy of like a frog being boiled in a pot of water. Like, you don't realize it until all of a sudden, you're boiling. So, yeah, I think that's going to be the hardest thing for a lot of people, because most people are going to have to go through these trainings. Like you and I know, we have the people in those trainings, their eyes are glossing over, but they're there, like even though they're not necessarily engaged with the material. But they have these little kernels that it's like, man, okay, yeah, that's true. So therefore, this bigger thing must be true, and then that just keeps going until all of a sudden you're completely bought in. So yeah, it's that just is my warning to people that do these trainings. Really, like Karlyn, it's like, keep your head about you and realize this is just bullshit, and it's divisive and it's not good for you. Yeah. Go ahead, Bray. You had a question?
Well, no, that it's just, to me, that I was going to add, like, if you were at any kind of position of power, or if you were a person that had the E or any kind of influence, that the podcast that Katie Herzog does with that the person is in an
Jesse Single
community or some either way. This woman describes the training, and
so she actually this woman in theater that Katie interviewed actually went through DiAngelo's training a year ago. Have you heard this one, Karlyn?
No, I haven't.
Oh, it's very good. I've shared it with a lot of powerful executives, women executives, and they're like loving it, and they're like passing it around, because it speaks perfectly to those that are traditionally progressive, is what I like to call them, like the 90s progressives, or the traditional progressives that aren't necessarily bought into the extreme wokeist stuff. But it's brilliant. Like, yeah, go ahead, Brian. It's a brilliant interview.
One way to do it. James Lindsay talked about a particular example of somebody that went through this kind of training. They had a trans employee. I believe that it was a trans woman. And this person then, after the training, all of these people then, this person had never experienced a considerable amount of bigotry, was doing pretty well there, everything was okay, right? But then after these trainings, would then and coworkers would come up to them and say, I've examined myself now and realized that I have had a lot of anti-trans bigotry, and that I have thought that secretly, but without telling you, that your lifestyle is disgusting. Right.
I'm sorry for that.
And I'm sorry.
I'm sorry for that.
I'm very sorry for that. I'm
sorry. I thought you were disgusting.
Right. When an apology is supposed to not help the apologizer, but the apologizee, right? It got so bad, and so many people were doing this, that the trans person quit because they couldn't take the bad workplace environment. So, I mean, rather than, you might make an argument that if this bettered workplace environment, this would be good, but I don't think that evidence is there, and I think there's evidence to the contrary. I mean, what's your thoughts?
No, I absolutely agree. And I think that one of the things that when I first started kind of going down the social justice rabbit hole, I realized it was making me more racist. It was making me look at people and treat people differently based on the color of their skin, which that had not been something I had even thought of prior to. So I absolutely agree that it's going to make workplaces worse. It's not going to make it better. And one of the things I do is I actually go into organizations and I measure their team's resiliency to see if they're as resilient as they could be and what they can do to improve their overall team resiliency. And one of the core components of a highly resilient team is psychological safety. Do coworkers trust one another? Do they feel like they're going to have each other's backs? Are they able to engage in open, productive conflict? This training is going to skewer all of that.
Yes.
100%.
And that's what I hope the HR directors and the managers and the leaders that are in the workplaces are actually doing surveys, because like at the end, I'm sure you do this too, Karlyn, at the end of every training, you want to make sure you want to gauge and see, okay, where were people before the training and where are people now. If DiAngelo's not doing it, or her disciples, which I'm sure they're not going to, I hope companies start putting together a post-training survey. Where were you before this? How do you feel now? Because I think a lot of people that do bucket are not going to feel comfortable with saying, I didn't agree with any of this. But if you make the survey anonymous and you say, okay, we're going to give these people a chance to give us feedback, that would be the best way. And I hope that data starts coming out soon, because I know it's going to be negative.
Well, not only does it have to be anonymous, it cannot be administered by the organization. It has to be administered by a third party. Otherwise, people are not actually going to trust that it's anonymous.
That's true.
Good point.
It's a good point.
Yeah, that it's really singular. A productive way to have conflict, right? A conflict resolution. And that's what you're engaging in the companies. And the higher degree of conflict resolution they have, probably the more adaptable they are. But it seems like anything based in critical theory, which white fragility is definitely based in this critical theory, there's no way to adjudicate problems based on offense. Like when a black issue is now in direct conflict with a Native American issue, there's simply no way to adjudicate that.
Well, and if we're taking it into the workplace, I mean, very rarely are you going to have issues that are actually directly related to race. What you're going to have is, maybe Johnny Jones and Susie Q are working on a project together. Like maybe they all pick something completely random. They're trying to get an email out about an event, right? Mm-hmm. And Johnny Jones is a straight white man and Susie Q is a queer black woman. Well, what happens when you have a conflict between those two about this innocuous little email that doesn't really mean anything in the grand scheme of things? Well, according to critical theory, Susie Q is always, always, always going to win that conflict, even if she's completely off base in what's going to be successful.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true. And that's why I think corporations are shooting themselves in the foot. They had the perfect formula of not focusing on these traits of people. And now it's just strange. It's just weird for me, seeing it like come in, because for so long it's been so vanilla and treat everyone the same, treat the people you want to be, the way you want to be treated. It's very basic rules that are now out the window.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting too, because I mean, I'll tell you what, like communication training, the DISC training, I actually do more of that than almost anything else. Last year was my best year ever in terms of corporate training for my business. Right now, it is near impossible to get this type of training administered in the workplace, because the white fragility training has taken over everything. All of the resources that were invested into doing actual productive trainings that could be measured and we had outcomes and all that has now been diverted to paying for this nonsense.
Yeah, because the companies only have a certain amount of budget for training. And I was lucky they actually created a role for one of the trainings or for a trainer such as myself, but typically companies don't do that, and they have a budget and they'll bring in third parties such as yourself, and once that budget's up, it's gone. And yeah, that's interesting. And I don't know if you know this, Karlyn. Does DiAngelo then take the $6,000 an hour she makes and give it back? Because isn't that the whole thing? You're supposed to give it back.
Well, I think we both know the answer to that, which is no, of course not. Robin DiAngelo has made millions of dollars as a white lady off of the pain of black and brown bodies, to use her words.
Wow.
I know. And brags about being a racist. It's just, it's hard to believe that some people will hold her up to be a hero when she says, I am a white supremacist, I'm a racist, and all these things that she says.
And the funny thing is,
not be your hero?
Yeah, but the funny thing is, she will never overcome. And that's the other thing, like with DISC and with all these other trainings, whether it's safety training or whatever, we could say, okay, look, we made these improvements. Now we move on to the next thing. And, you keep moving and you get better as a company. Her training will never end because you can never overcome it. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Right? She'll never not be a racist.
It's a lifetime of work.
No, if you are a white person, you are racist. Yeah. And actually, there's one passage in the book that I want to read it really quickly just because it's one of the more funny I'm a racist passage. And throughout the entire book, what people need to understand is she confesses her racism throughout the entire book. Like there's story after story of her being a racist. But on page 146 of the printed copy, she says, "Many people of color have assured me that they will not give up on me despite my racist patterns. They expect that I will have racist behavior given the society that socialized me."
Yeah.
It's like, she's flat out said it in the book, and you guys are still paying her money to do anti-racist training in your organizations. It makes no sense.
No, it's just it's disgusting, and like that, you know, like I love the work you're doing. I love the work James is doing, and Helen, and even Bogosian in that realm. And it's something we need to really understand, because you're going to get blindsided by this. You're going to show up to work and it's going to be, hey, white fragility training, and then you're going to be called a racist all day, and you're not going to know how to react. And it's just sad, you know, and it definitely hit home for me. So,
but the fact that this isn't evidenced, right? I mean, one of the reasons why I see declining religiosity and things like that is science has done a bit of a number on religion, and some of the faith claims simply can't be substantiated. When science is staring in the face, especially if you're like, say, a young Earth creationist, you just can't. So, exposing that this is unevidenced, I think, has got to be a big part of this.
Yeah.
That all of this, like for example, the Jackie Robinson claim. I'd never heard that. Oh, Jackie Robinson was the first black player to be good enough to play in the major leagues. I've watched enough baseball to know that's not true. I mean, right. Satchel Paige, Joey Gibson, that everybody said that. I wish they were in the major leagues so we could have tested them against Ruth and Gehrig and the other greats. Like this, does she evidences that there's something at the Baseball Hall of Fame that says this? Where is she getting this narrative other than just pulling it out of the air? It seems like she went to like alt-right crazy, bin store bargain base to get this. I've never even heard these narratives.
Well, she's pulling it out of thin air, and I'll tell you what, I am convinced she's lying in this book too. I flat out think she's lying, and as a corporate trainer, I mean, this very early on in the book, she talked about how she goes in to do corporate training, and people come in angry, and they're stomping around and throwing their notebooks on the table. That's never happened to me. Has that happened to you as a corporate trainer, where people were like overt, like
no,
very
no. No, we lost you for a second there, but no, I've never had people like when people are going to these trainings, it's gonna suck, and especially like the all day trainings, it's like, oh man, it's gonna suck. But there are ways to engage people, like they always love donuts and stuff like that. But there's ways to like make them fun and interactive and get people up and moving and stuff. So then they're not so bad. So initially, are they a little negative towards it? Yeah, but I've never seen, I've been doing it for years. I've never seen someone come in and throwing stuff around, and it's like, that's definitely she's embellishing.
If
definitely.
anything, I've seen grumbling later. I usually see silence at the time. Yeah. Maybe one person makes a small but polite objection, is shut down. No one else says anything, and everybody grumbles about it afterwards.
Yeah.
But for example, the one that I remember was somebody, like the HR person, came up and said, we had 10 new hires this month, all of them, and then gave them, all were minority. And she said, we were 100% diverse. And there were people looking around, and then people were saying, no one said it at the time, but everybody said, what isn't that?
Yeah.
How is that 100% diverse?
Right.
I've got a funny story for you guys. I think you'll appreciate this. So for years now, when I do my corporate training, I have my PowerPoint and all this stuff, and I used to use just like stock photos in my PowerPoints. And then slowly but surely over the course of many trainings, I started to hear, Karlyn, you have too many white people in your PowerPoints. It's like you're using stock photos. You're just trying to find the best photo you can as quickly as you can.
Right.
And so over the course of years, I slowly started reducing the number of white people, because even if there were only a couple people in the PowerPoint, I would still hear about it. Well, about a month and a half ago, I actually did this training in which I had 0 white people in any of the slides. I mostly use like illustrations or things that weren't real people, because I just got sick of having the argument. What did I get told by the diversity person after the training? You had too many white people in your slides.
Wow.
It's like they go on autopilot with this stuff. I'm like, I had 0 white people.
It's so true. It's so true. Yeah.
What about this, like Bertrand Kurt Russell? Welcome back from the grave, I guess. Said that Robin DiAngelo is a racist, and rather than deal with her baggage, she wants to call everybody else racist. What do you think that's true? She wants everyone else to shoulder her burden?
Well, I mean, the whole book is projection, right? And basically, the idea of projection is that you have identified something in yourself, probably subconsciously, that you don't like about yourself. But it's a lot easier to deal with that thing when you put it onto other people than to look at yourself. And so, if she's a racist, which we know from reading the book, like it's much easier for her to project her racism onto every other white person and then go try to fix every other white person than to admit that she has some issues that she needs to work out.
That's absolutely right. That is brilliantly put. Absolutely. She's projecting. She's a white supremacist with a guilty conscience.
Well, what do you say to like,
Carl Benjamin, 2017.
That might say, okay, well, I need a person that looks like me, like at the front of the class, whether it be a teacher or a trainer or something like that. That's why we need diversity for that reason.
Why can't that person be you?
Yeah.
Go put yourself at the front of the class.
Yeah.
Well, no, man, but like, say you were a student. This is often used in education, that the reason why black students aren't getting ahead is because the person in front of the class doesn't look like them. Or at least that's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah.
No, absolutely not. A good teacher is going to be a good teacher regardless of their white, black, brown, otherwise. Right. I mean, what they're saying is that they need a better teacher, maybe, and maybe the better teacher. I don't think someone's qualifications to be a teacher or a trainer or any of these other things rests on the color of their skin.
Right.
I just don't.
It's like we can't take Michael Jordan as a role model because we're not black. It's the same thing. It's like absolutely all the kids in the 90s did. Every single one of us.
Right.
that watched basketball. Right.
Yeah, I think that a 60-year-old man is allowed to have a 25-year-old woman as a hero if that person is speaking them into a way that's inspiring them. I don't see anything wrong with that.
Yeah.
Like
there's this funny story that's my wife told me this. I can't name names obviously, but someone had a child. One of her friends had a child, and the kid's like 6 or 7, really young. It was Halloween, and he wanted to go as Stanley from The Office. Did you watch The Office, Brian?
Yes.
Okay, he's a little white kid, so he wanted to go as Stanley from The Office because he loved Stanley. He thought he was hilarious, right? And his mother had to then like explain to him why he couldn't go as Stanley from The Office, and like she had to do it like in like little kid terms and stuff, not getting into the whole blackface stuff, but saying hey, you can't do that.
That's watching The Office.
I don't know. He loved it, and like it was like in a little kid fashion. He just like okay, then go as Spider-Man or whatever. Like it wasn't no big deal to him because but it was just kind of funny. It's just like we can. There's people that can identify with people with other races and genders. And see them as something to aspire to.
You're still allowed to, but go on.
Good. I once heard Adam Carolla tell a story of when he went as Mr. T for Halloween, and he did the whole thing, and he, made himself look like Mr. T.
Yep.
And I think he almost was trying to preempt getting called out for blackface, and he refused to apologize. He was like, no, I went as Mr. T as an homage because I like Mr. T. I'm not apologizing for this. And I thought that was great. Like, stand your ground.
Well, he ended up apologizing afterwards.
Did he?
Oh, yeah. And, Fallon did the same thing. He went as Chris Rock one year. Same thing. He got in the same trouble. I'd apologize. But whatever.
You can flip and do to the genders, right? I could dress up as women for Halloween, right? Big to say that's some kind of bad appropriation might run right up against the trans thing, because I don't know if some sort of transvestism is in LGBT or not.
Yeah.
But
I don't know if you can actually dress up as a woman anymore. Maybe you could a few years ago, but give it a try this year, see what happens.
Yeah.
But I could just say I'm non-binary. That's the other thing. Do you think that some people, if this gains traction, you just check the non-binary box? It doesn't necessarily, you can be non-binary in any possible way. I could just check it. And now I have a certain amount of...
And no one can disprove it.
And you're gaming the system. What do you think? Will that happen?
I mean, who said that Donald Trump should just declare that, just identify as a woman and be the first female president? I mean, it's brilliant.
Yeah, that. And also I said as soon as Donald Trump came out in support of the protests, they would have ended. He should have said, I support Antifa and the protests.
And
then Antifa would have stopped existing. And Well, Karlyn, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an hour. Sorry for the technical problems in the beginning.
All right.
Frickin' Skype. So you are going to be in Milwaukee in a couple of weeks. So
I'm really excited.
Yeah, it's exciting. We're gonna have you there. A bunch of other people now. we, unlike the protesters, follow the law, so we will have masks. We will be doing social distancing and all that stuff. But it's going to be weird because it's not going to be a giant event like we normally do, but it's going to be fun. And yeah, we have some amazing people coming to it, so really excited to have you. Is there anything else you want to mention before the hour's up here?
No, I mean, I'm really excited to be joining you in Milwaukee as the pasty white girl on the racial equality panel, and so that's going to be a good time.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because, like I was telling you before, we actually had it was Zuby was on it, Nico House, Melissa Chen, and it's escaping me right now. Zuby, Nico House, Melissa Chen.
There was one more.
Yeah, so I'm forgetting. I'm so sorry,
so
whoever it was. It's changed so much. But there wasn't a white person on it. And then we actually got trolled for not having a white person on the racial equity panel. So that was kind of a sign of where we are today. It's interesting.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about putting a baby goat up there as a scapegoat, in the panel.
Please do it, please.
Did you just come up with that?
Nothing can go wrong with that plan.
Right. Right. So yeah, so we're excited to have you, Brian. I'll let you close it out. I'm gonna go.
But yeah, we're excited. That panel is going to be like, what are the barriers to racial equity? And you mentioned one of them. You think lack of fathers. I tend to agree, but we'll be able to expand on that some more in that panel. And again, I really think that if we're going to talk about this, and it's probably something we should talk about, everybody needs a chance to talk. It's not the agreed that you have to be able to talk about this, and everyone's got to get a little more comfortable. So we're going to do it there. We're going to probably add a TBA on there, and we're looking to find somebody who is coming from a little bit more anti-racist standpoint, so we have as much balance as we can. That's TBA, and but either way, Nico is kind of, I think, somewhere in the middle. So I think this will be a really good conversation, and I'm looking forward to it. So again, really happy to talk to you. I'm excited, and thanks for breaking down white fragility. You should definitely watch that video. I loved it because it's really good. You really see this, and you see a genuine reaction to it, and you can kind of see why this is a hard-to-read book because, man, it's loaded. So, again, thanks, and hang on for a second. We just want to talk to you about some technical things after, and thanks for watching, everyone. Okay, we're off. Cool.